course correction. We look forward to spending the morning with you, and we'll give marathon medals to those of you at the end who make it to the end. I know other people will be coming in as well, so please help make them welcome and make room. I also want to commend very quickly my colleagues in the economic growth program at New America Foundation, Sam Sheridan, who's right here, and not more importantly, but as importantly, Cheryl Schweninger and Michael Lynn, both of whom you'll be hearing from later, who co-direct this program and have laid out a lot of the intellectual agenda of the New America Foundation. And it's great to see old friends. I see Alan Tonelson here, who, years ago we worked together in the 1990s. He was author, of course, of Race to the Bottom, which I think is one of the definitive statements about what was perceived to then be happening in the U.S. economy. Bob Kuttner, who is in today's program and author of the forthcoming, I'm going to show it to you because I'm so excited. It's a bit of a downer, but it's called A Presidency in Peril, the inside story of Obama's promise, Wall Street's power, and the struggle to control our economic future. This is interesting because a year ago, Bob Kuttner gave me his book just like this about Obama's promise. I don't remember exactly the title, but I was at a Democratic convention, and Bob said, "Steve, you've got to read this and review it for your blog." And mentioning the blog, I do want to welcome those people who are watching online at the Washington Note, at the American Strategy Program, New America Foundation website, and other sites. There are quite a number of online viewers this morning. Mentioning the 1990s is important. At the time, I worked for Senator Jeff Bingaman in the U.S. Senate. Afterwards, I went to work for Clyde Prestowitz at the Economic Strategy Institute, where Alan Tonelson had also been. Bob Kuttner and many of you had also been in these debates, and I feel as if much of the work and spade work we did and the thinking, the policy front, that was largely ignored in the 1990s because what was going on, the IT bubble seemed to be endlessly producing kinds of jobs and a sense of innovation and of wealth in the United States, that kind of the real economy was being completely ignored. And I feel that all of that has come back, but the United States in many ways is much less prepared to deal with the things that were being outlined. And also in this town you see what a combination of amnesia and dereliction of duty can do, because those people who helped, in fact, prognosticate and sort of look into the future at some of the negative trends aren't exactly rewarded for that. They have been pushed in the ears. And two of the great leaders in this area for some time are on this stage with me right now, and I'm going to say a couple words from them and about New America Foundation's program before we have a discussion between Leo Hendrie and Senator Byron Dorgan on this issue. Leo Hendrie, many of you know, is a former CEO. If the mythology is right, a former Republican CEO, kind of a hard-driving Republican CEO. And we became friends at one point after he'd been, of course, President and CEO of TCI, former chairman and CEO of the Global Center, of AT&T Broadband and the Yankee Entertainment and Sports Network, and is now managing partner of Intermedia Partners. He's chairman of our U.S. Economy Smart Globalization Initiative here at the New America Foundation. But the real story with Leo Hendrie that I found interesting is he wrote a book and began thinking about the stakeholder approach to economic behavior, to what was happening with looking at labor and finance and what was happening in the economy and the offshoring debate, and came out to some of the issues we said, that there's a short-termism and also a dominance of the financial and capital sectors of the economy at the cost of every other segment of the economy. And playing on It Takes a Village, he wrote a book called It Takes a CEO. What he was really saying is it takes a shareholder structure, a stakeholder structure, where you look at the combined interest of a great number of people. And Leo has been at the forefront of trying to promulgate a more responsible stewardship of the American economy by American policymakers. And rather than advocating non-serious solutions to some of these issues, looking at the real ones. And where I think, particularly during the economic crisis, Leo and Don Riegel and others have been out writing in a group that Leo has put together about the importance of jobs and infrastructure investment. He led on a project called the Horizon Project that looked at components of the American economy and basically the high-wage job structure in the country, and looked at what great deficits were there. And he's continuing. I think he's actually changed the discourse finally. Most papers writing about the monthly job performance now use effective unemployment, real unemployment, as their gauge, rather than the official levels, which are, hide and mask so many people that are discouraged workers or non-counted workers or people that are underemployed, to try to bring a focus on that. Unfortunately, so far he's only got about 40% of the administration listening to him, but we're trying to work on the rest. Senator Byron Dorgan is someone who inspired a lot of the work that I did in the 1990s, listening to him when he's been in Democratic leadership forever. It seems, of course, he's chairman of the Democratic Policy Committee right now, but in the 1990s, he was one of the few brave senators that was willing to go out on the floor and talk about what an alternative structure would look like to what we had, which I consider to be kind of manic neoliberalism, which was, not looking at how do you preserve high-wage jobs or incentivize and create a healthy innovation structure in the country that generates long-term benefits and to sort of appropriately play the role of the senator. He's, of course, the U.S. Senator from North Dakota, served 6 terms in the House of Representatives. He's a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, the Commerce Committee, the Energy Committee, and he's the author of Reckless: How Debt, Deregulation, and Dark Money Nearly Bankrupted America. We'll do a book event for that here if you'd like. We haven't done that for you. We can, and also a book that I enjoyed and was enjoyed the book party and his talk for it at the time was Take This Job and Ship It: How Corporate Greed and Brain Dead Politics Are Selling Out America. I can't tell you how disappointed I am that the senator has decided to retire, because there aren't many like him who've done this. And there are other issues in the senator's portfolio that I feel that the country owes him a great deal. One that I'm looking at right now in a completely different area is corporate contracting and issues overseas that deserves so much credit. I mean, I can't wait till healthcare in any form is done, off the plate, because we can begin looking at, other really important, serious issues that have been percolating, and Senator Dorgan has been at these for so long, and he's been someone who's been trying to argue with I shouldn't call it the dark side, that's probably reckless, but the people who essentially don't believe there's an economic interest to pursue. Essentially, that's the bottom line. When you hear a job is a job, or you hear no orientation about what the role of government, that economic strategy can't mean anything for some reason, because then you would be pursuing an economic interest as opposed to letting the invisible hand and laissez-faireism completely dominate where we've been, and look where it has gotten us. It was noted that 15 years ago, a little over 15 years ago, Senator Dorgan wrote the cover story for the Washington Monthly magazine, with which the New America Foundation has an important partnership. And in that, he wrote about derivatives, and he was one of the lead opponents of legislation that helped promulgate the derivative sector. And essentially the bottom line of the piece is, watch out, if we pass this legislation, if derivatives become as unregulated, these will explode and we will have taxpayer bailouts. And that was 15 years ago, and I think he was absolutely proved right. The New America Foundation, just very much in brief, under the leadership of Michael Lind and Cheryl Schweninger and Sam Sherratt and others, and Leo Hendrie's chairmanship, is going to do its darndest in the next year, 2 years, to put a spotlight, to do what many of our colleagues did in the 1990s and try to resurrect the question of what a serious national security and national economic policy, and I put national security policy there for a reason, to look at what restoring the vitality and health of the U.S. industry would look like when you look at various sectors, looking at the manufacturing jobs policies of the country and the fact that we see continued deterioration. My colleague Michael Lind has written some important papers that I think are out, I may be misspeaking here, on looking at Build America bonds and manufacturing credit systems. But what we're going to try to do is attach policy initiatives that are doable, that are reachable, and begin putting together a package and getting beyond the generic and getting down to the specific, and doing what I think the New America Foundation does best, which is to embarrass the bad decisions of the other guys and then alternatively to try to put better ideas on the table. We're going to look and try and push hard, as many others are as well, on public investment and infrastructure investment, advocating things like the National Infrastructure Bank, which both New America and CSIS and others have done a lot of good, important spade work. Looking at the state fiscal questions, in which this is one of the biggest fears, I think, of the next year, of a $200 to $300 billion shortfall in state-based revenues, which is going to be incredibly destimulative over this next year. Looking at the question of competitiveness and swapping corporate and payroll tax cuts with potentially a value-added tax. Global trade adjustment, but making global economic rebalancing not something that we are necessarily just begging for others to play along with, but actually looking at the tools to try and achieve this. Looking at our leverage in procurement and how you can couple procurement, as we used to do in the United States, and frankly all of our trading partners are doing, with their own important, innovative, and R&D and manufacturing sectors. One of the interesting things, and I don't know if it was Leo Hendrie who wrote it or something, but when you look at the global economy, which is have a lot of integration, that in that highly integrated sector, you've got the United States essentially with the WTO and with a lot of international trade and economic institutions acting as if it shouldn't have interest in this. Where all of our trading partners, if you go to Ireland, to Malaysia, to China, of course, you've got plans. You've got them doing an annual basis of what the Harvard Business School does for companies. SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. They know what their inputs are, their outputs are. We act, maybe some of us do that at the state level in the United States, but we do not do that at the federal level, and that has to change. Looking at energy policy, public purpose banking, and of course financial institutional reform. But one of the themes that we put in today's program was to contrast serious versus non-serious proposals. And there's a lot of non-serious cosmetic stuff. Fig leaves. I remember, with all due respect to some of my friends who've been advocates of trade adjustment assistance, trade adjustment assistance in the old days when we would pass trade bills became a fig leaf for giving people an opportunity to support the various trade legislation we had while signing on to training and adjustment programs. Try and get those trade and adjustment programs assigned to you if you had a company. So to a certain degree, we've had a lot of fig leafism as we looked at these economic questions. And I think what we're trying to do at the New America Foundation under the leadership of my colleagues is begin to say we need a more serious proposal, and we're going to use our strengths, which I think are both intellectual, but also in communications and helping to convene to begin put together an alternative structure. So without further ado, I want you to help welcome Leo Hendrie and Senator Dorgan, who are going to have a conversation here. And after about 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to come back and moderate a few questions. And I want to thank in advance Senator Dorgan very much for joining this morning, and Leo for your leadership in suggesting that we have this conference today. So thank you both. Leo, the floor is yours.
Probably the easiest place for me to start is where we aren't. And in December 13th, members of this administration at the most senior levels declared the recession over. And I think roughly 4 weeks later in Massachusetts, an awful lot of women and men suggested otherwise. And what I'd like to do, Senator, is sort of talk about a bucket that I think is quite empty. 3 years ago plus, you began an initiative with your colleagues to look at real unemployment. We tried to help you in that area. Numbers that we use, and I think these are quite verifiable, is that we have to find quickly 22 million jobs. Everything after that is sort of frosting, so to speak, on that cake. But we are short 22 million jobs to be near full employment. We have twice the unemployment rate in real terms that we do in official terms. We have 30 million women and men who are seeking employment, not 15 million. And it strikes several of us, and many of us, Senator, that there are actually actions to fill the bucket. And I would summarize them as three. Infrastructure, youth-based out-of-school youth unemployment programs, and a complete revisiting or reformatting of our relationship with China. That will substantially refill the bucket. From that point on, you can talk well and cogently about manufacturing policy and industrial policy, the reform of so much of what you have talked about for so many years as being in need of reform. But why don't we maybe start with that, which is sort of this, where are we and where aren't we? And then sort of where you and your colleagues think we need to head from there.
Well, that's a big topic, a big subject. Let me maybe start. Yesterday on the floor of the Senate, or maybe the day before, I told a brief story. Let me start with a story, if I might. The first week I was in Congress, 30 years ago, I went to see the oldest member of the House, named Claude Pepper. Heard of him, never met him, so I walked into his office. He was then in his, I think, mid-80s. And his office was a little like a museum in the sense it had so many interesting things in it. So I went to see him and meet him. And he had two photographs on the wall that I've never forgotten behind his desk. One was of Orville and Wilbur Wright, December 17th, 1903, making that 59-second airplane flight, first human-powered flight to leave the ground and fly. And it was autographed to Congressman Claude Pepper with deep admiration from Orville Wright before Orville died. And then just beneath it...
That's how old Orville was.
That's right. But just beneath it, the first human being to step foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong, a photograph of his stepping on the moon, autographed to Congressman Claude Pepper with deep admiration. So here's a living American that has an autographed picture of the first person to leave in powered flight and then fly all the way to the moon and put a boot print on the moon. And I was thinking of the distance, 1903, 1969. That was a period of time when this country was alive with innovation, creativity, jobs, expanding the middle class, lifting America up, a completely different time. And then from about that time, 1970 forward, we've had a completely different economy, very different. And it is interesting. That's about the time globalization began to trot and then gallop. And we became engaged in the global economy, but the rules never kept pace. And so we've had a much different experience in the last 40 years. I'm talking now especially about working families than we did between 1900 and 1970. And I think the question now, I mean, it's very hard to look beyond this deep recession. I mean, it's almost all of our energy is consumed by trying to figure out how do you get out of this hole, put me back to work right now. But the larger question, even as we do that, is what kind of an economy do we want, and how do we achieve that kind of economy? We boast and brag that we don't plan. You know, the other countries do, but we don't plan. And we somehow believe that it will be likely that other countries will ignore their own self-interest. I mean, that's, of course, against all the evidence. Japan won't do that. China won't do that. So we're engaged in a competition that is really just unilateral. We're doing it this way by ourselves. Everyone else is engaged in a competition with a different set of rules, which relates to this question of how are we going to find jobs to put people back to work, and how do you make an economy of the type that we want that is sustainable in the long term for our country. And it relates to a lot of issues, trade issues and industrial policy and manufacturing and so on.
In your first book, which I've always lauded you for, it's the best title of a book I've ever, it just flew off the shelves. It was the Take This Job and Ship It book. There seems to be a sense within some of your colleagues on the Hill, but particularly in this administration, the new administration, as Steve alluded to in his opening comments, that a job is a job. And you obviously argued strongly otherwise, that we have just under 9% of American women and men actually making things today in this country. Less than 12% of our GDP comes from manufacturing. For some in influence, that's acceptable. For yourself, and certainly in that first book, you found it completely unacceptable, that it's unsustainable. And yet, when you measure the recovery in terms of GDP growth, you don't have to address that question one way or the other. A little bit of profitability restored at Goldman Sachs and on Wall Street can give us a positive GDP. Do you want to sort of talk about what is the number, and it's certainly not a precise one, but where do you have to take this country, coming back to the themes of that first book?
Well, the reason I wrote the book is really, again, looking at the last 40 years or so, the assumptions seem to be that whatever happens is fine and it will represent the best for our country's future. I don't believe that. And I don't believe that there is a divine right for America 25, 50, or 75 years from now to remain a world economic power. It will if we do the right things and make the right choices for our country, but there's no divine right by which we will always be an economic power. And so what are those choices? Can you remain a dominant economic power if you don't make things, if you don't produce things? I don't think so. Can you remain a dominant economic power if you have a complete atrophy of your manufacturing base? I don't think so. I mean, I think and I used to ask Carla Hills when I was on the Ways and Means Committee and she was trade ambassador. I kept hectoring her about this. I kept saying, is there anything without which our country would be in trouble? Or are you just willing to say, whatever happens, happens? We're just really proud and pleased that we're not going to manage our economy in any way. Let what happens happen. Is there anything that would concern you? The loss of the steel industry? The loss of the automobile industry? Is there anything that would concern you? The answer was, no, really, that would be picking winners and losers, and we're not in the business of managing our economy. Well, boasting about incompetence is hardly something to boast about, in my judgment. Our country has a responsibility to be involved in our self-interest and build the kind of economy and the opportunities we want for the future. And we've not been doing that, but we need to very soon if we're going to remain a world economic power, in my judgment.
Can we find in the near term, and we can't even wait till the medium term, in my opinion, can we find in the near term a revisit of Mrs. Hill's comments to you, which have been echoed by this new administration? A job we obviously believe, many of us, is not a job, and that there is this plateau below which you can't go as to how many people actually make things. But when we look at the biggest impetus to where we have gotten, it's frankly within the last decade, China. China, as it moves into being the second largest economy, already surpassing Germany and headed to passing Japan sometime this year. Where is the political will to have this conversation? And I guess I would close it by saying that if we continue to fall back on these false measures of vitality, income, economic, personal vitality that are false, how do you get that dialogue going here within the next few months?
It's very hard to get this dialogue going seriously because the institutional newspapers in this country, they won't even print an op-ed with views like mine, and I don't think my views are so unusual. It's just that we ought to stand up for our country's economic interest and worry about jobs going overseas in search of cheap labor and so on. But it's very hard. The minute that you begin discussing these things about trying to protect our economic interest and to create and nurture jobs in our country, you are called some sort of xenophobic isolationist stooge that just can't see over the horizon and just doesn't get it. You just don't get it. Now let me say that. Think of this as a bathtub. We're working on Capitol Hill, and today the president will sign a bill that's trying to incentivize new jobs. Right? I mean, it's a laudable goal. All of us want to try to do the things that will incentivize new jobs. Well, even as we do that, that's the faucet, right? That's putting jobs in the tub. Even as we do that, we've got a wide open drain. So I'm on an airplane the other day, and I'm sitting next to a guy who's wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt. And I said, where are you going? He said, well, the reason I'm dressed this way is I'm going to Asia. I said, what are you going to do there? Well, he said, I'm going to Thailand, I'm going to Singapore, I'm going to China. He said, I represent XYZ company, and our suppliers are all in the U.S., and we're going to get our suppliers for our parts to move to Asia. So I'm going to scout out locations, and then the companies that supply us, we're going to move those jobs over here because it's a competitive advantage for us. And I'm thinking, here's a guy sitting next to me, probably on the way to Asia to trade off 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 American jobs. They don't know it yet. Those folks that have those jobs don't know it. But it goes on every day, all around the clock. And that's the drain. The drain's wide open. We've got to find some way to address this issue of jobs in the new global economy, the economy without established effective rules to try to protect those of us that have lifted standards. We've got to find a way to address these issues. And almost no one wants to do it in the Congress. I mean, it's very hard to get legislation passed. And no administration, including this one, has any remote interest in addressing it. But I don't think you can build back the kind of job base that we want in our country, strengthen our manufacturing base, and be a country that does produce things, that be a country in which you can buy things that do say, made in America again. I don't think you can do that without addressing the drain, that is, addressing the issue of trade and jobs.
Arguably, and I think it's now irrefutable, about 90% of the cost differential in manufactured goods between the United States and China is not labor-based. It's subsidy, currency manipulation, poor environmental practices, many illegal, some right on the edge. Which seems to me sort of driving a lot of this is this sort of false belief that the wages of the United States are what are making us uncompetitive. You've argued, and certainly we've tried to as well, that in fact it's cheating. That there's from our side of the ledger, there's this conscious decision we're not going to push back, and from the other side of the ledger, there's this quite conscious decision that they're going to use every means available to them, some legal, some illegal, to advance their trade positions. And it seems that our legislative response, Senator, is to extend unemployment insurance, to give a tax credit to finding a new job. I've run very large companies. I have never hired a woman or man based on a tax credit. I hire them based on certainty. I have to feel that the economy wants me to succeed, at which point you go out and hire people. And any sort of try to wrap that together?
Well, yeah, I mean, I taught economics ever so briefly in college at night when I was a statewide elected official. I taught some economics. I was able to overcome that, however, and go on to lead a reasonably productive life. What I told students was that all these, you need to learn the supply-demand curves. You need to learn all the fundamentals. But understand that this economy works mostly based on people's assessment of the future. Are people confident about the future? If they are, they buy a suit, buy a car, buy a home, take a trip. They do things that are expansive to the economy. If they are not confident about the future, their job, their security, their family, they do exactly the opposite. They defer the purchase, defer the trip, defer the car, and that's the contraction phase of the economy. So, I mean, this is not what has happened to America now, this deep economic hole, the deepest since the Great Depression. That is not part of the business cycle. I mean, that's part of the bursting of a bubble full of avarice, greed, ignorance, the most unbelievable story. And someday somebody will write the definitive narrative. It should have been Congress. Congress should have had a special select committee, but Congress hasn't done that, and we haven't done it in a number of areas. But someday somebody will write that narrative and we'll understand it a little better. Now we've got to try to get out of this deep hole, and we need to do the things that will instill confidence in the American people. And part of that, I think, gets back to what we described at the start. Our country needs to describe the conditions under which we participate in the global economy. To say, look, here are the conditions. At the moment, those conditions are whatever happens, happens. And it's okay if China wants to send us now in the next couple of years a massive number of low-priced cars made in China because they're ramping up a big automobile export industry. And we negotiated a deal with China with whom we had a $200 billion trade deficit. And we said, when you send us your cars, we'll impose a 2.5% tariff on them. And we agree with you that when we send you any cars from our country to sell in China, you should be able to impose a 25% tariff. So a country with whom we had a $200 billion trade deficit, then we said you should have a 10-to-1 advantage in bilateral automobile trade tariffs. I mean, there's no other way to describe that except as ignorant of our own economic interests. And we need to start step by step by step rebuilding and understanding that our self-interest is something we should not be ashamed of. We want to expand world trade. We want to do the things that help lift others up, but not at the expense of pushing this country's standards down. It took us a century to build them. But we've got to give people confidence about the future, first and foremost. And that'll come from, it seems to me, a debate that results in good public policy standing up for our country's economic interests.
Let me go back to, Steve introduced us by commenting that the senator has spoken sort of before the clouds were even upon us about this real unemployment. The official unemployment loss in the United States in the month of February was 36,000 jobs. Yet if we actually go out and try to find women and men with faces and social security numbers and names, we actually lost 480,000 more jobs. The unemployment rate on real terms actually rose in February. It didn't decline to almost 19%. If we get past health care in the next several days, is there just an exhaustion that's going to be there in Congress, or can we find the will to try to fill that bucket?
Oh man, post-healthcare. We'll see what happens at the end of this week and next week, and perhaps even I guess the next week the Congress is gone. But this healthcare debate has been a long and tortured trail. It appears to me we're near the end of that trail, and so a healthcare bill will likely be signed into law. And then we've got to turn to financial reform. We just have to do that. And we've got to get that right. I have precious little interest, by the way, in giving the Federal Reserve Board, an institution that has made so many mistakes so often for so long, giving them substantial new powers, believing that's going to fix what's ailing America. But we're going to have a big debate about financial reform. Even as we do that, we're going to continue to work on a jobs agenda. There are a lot of things we have to do to try to instill confidence, to try to provide additional incentives. This is a very tough time. This administration, as you know, inherited the biggest economic mess, perhaps in history, except for FDR. And had Barack Obama done nothing on fiscal policy, after he assumed the reins of this government, there was going to be a $1.3 trillion federal budget deficit had he slept for 12 months. We had, the job losses were in the 600, 700,000 jobs a month being lost. So that's what this president inherited. And, I'm critical of some of the things of this administration, but I'm pleased it's there as compared to the previous administration. And we're trying to build our way out of an unbelievable hole. But but let me just say again, I think it's important for us to think about what is transformational about a new economy. We should not talk about the old economy. I didn't like the old economy very much. The last 40 years didn't work very well. Working folks didn't do very well in that old economy, and jobs were moving elsewhere. We need to talk about a transformational economy in which we develop new thoughts and new approaches to how do you restore a manufacturing base so that America makes things. How do you make sure that we don't get into the same financial problems we just did? What kind of rules do you put back in place? Maybe dealing with Glass-Steagall and a whole range of issues like that. We shouldn't nibble around the edges. We need to go right to the center, right to the heart of these issues, and try to say to our country, it's time, it's long past the time for us to make fundamental decisions about what kind of an economy we want, what kind of future we want, that will put people back to work and provide some support for the middle class in this country.
Let me follow up with one sort of last extension of that, and then we'll go to the Q&A. There's an awful lot of attention paid to the phrase that small and medium-sized businesses define and are the growth of the economy. A number of us are arguing that that was actually valid after we had established a base of manufacturing. And I look at cities near your home state of North Dakota, certainly in Michigan and Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, where there's just been massive, devastating job loss. Mm-hmm. And I come from the school that while I'm respectful of the small to medium-sized business, I can't fix Dayton, Ohio from the bottom up with small applications. And you spoke a moment ago of this chap you met on the airplane who is, in moving his manufacturing jobs overseas, probably represents several thousand jobs. Just for this audience to understand, if we do, in fact, as a group, grow to conclude that we need 22 million jobs, we would have to form roughly 100 new General Electric companies, 100 new IBMs. We have to have a large business orientation to acknowledge the fact that we lost it, to couple with and complement the small and medium-sized side. Do you want to finish on that thought, and then we'll go to some questions and answers here from these folks?
This is a big mountain to climb. There's no question about it. When you talk about the number of jobs we have to create in order to put our country back on track, restart the economic engine, and give people a feeling that there's a job for them out there. This is a steep, steep hill to climb. But we don't have much choice. I mean, we've got to tackle this, and as I said just a moment ago, I don't think you tackle this with small bore weapons. I mean, you got to go at this with big ideas and transformational ideas It's a different time. As I said earlier, there's no inherent birthright for this country to remain a world economic power if we don't start making some smart decisions. Yes, we've got a fiscal policy problem with long, unsustainable deficits. We have to get our arms around that. But we also have to understand we've got trade policies we've got to fix. We need a new trade policy for our country. We need an industrial policy. We need a manufacturing policy. There are a lot of things that we need to do that we don't even touch because, you can't even have those discussions in the major newspapers of our country. In fact, I was just looking at something somebody gave me about a piece of public policy that is dealing with the Chinese, and the Chinese are getting American companies to lobby our government not to do that, which would be in our self-interest to do. There's so much going on in that respect. We've got to pull ourselves up by the collar and say, you know what? Those that left us this country, our grandparents and great-grandparents and others, those that built this country, built the interstate, and built all the things that made when I say the interstate, I'm talking about the dowry that we were left and inherited. We owe them more than we're giving them. It's unbelievable. And it's our job to try to fix this.
Thank you both. Now, let me open the floor. We've just got a few minutes, so I'm sure there are going to be more questions than we have time for, so forgive me, and we will continue to involve all of you in discussions as we move on this morning. I want to also recognize Congressman Bruce Braley, who's joined us here. It's great to have you with us, and we look forward to your next forum. But let's go to Mitzi Wertheim up here in the front.
First, I want to thank the New America Foundation for doing this event. I've been worrying about these problems for a long time. I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I work for the Naval Postgraduate School. I'm a social anthropologist, so I look at the world through a very broad set of lenses. The question I've been asking is, as you look at it, what's the work we want to have people to do? I mean, you talk about IBM and GE. I worked for IBM for 13 years, and I was there as they were scaling everything down. How do we get people to understand we need to do it? And how do we create the programs to help them get started? And more importantly, has anybody thought about what the distribution of jobs ought to be and match it up with our educational system?
Thank you.
I think that's actually the heart of the issue. And it starts from the vantage point I have, which is we cannot survive, as the senator has suggested, with less than 9% of women and men in this country making things. We have to acknowledge that these were wonderful jobs. They raised families, that the wages were stable, they brought benefits, and this reliance on the service economy. And I do believe that the answer is found in matching the realities of our demographics with jobs. And I think the answers are actually quite simple. We have to stop on the left side of the equation cheaters. We can't beat people who cheat. And it's just a reality. There's no game in the world that you can win if you're playing an opponent who cheats. And we know where that comes from. But on our side of the ledger, the sort of this right brain side, we should explore these tax reforms that would incent a corporation to keep jobs here. The senator made a strong point about that again in his first book. Eliminate these tax abuses that we thought were promised in the 2008 campaign, and yet we've not yet addressed. There are domestic reforms around perhaps a reduction of corporate and personal income taxes, and payroll taxes to be substituted by a VAT. There's a lot we can do in domestic-based R&D, but it has to be, and I think that was the point of both books, it has to be done under the rubric of a policy. If you don't have a policy, you don't have actions. And then you come from the bottom up and you extend unemployment. You fall back on the bromide, the canard of let's re-educate America. If any one of us in this room were king or queen, we couldn't do it in 20 years. All the while, millions of jobs will continue to be sent overseas. We have sufficiently educated, informed, and capable employees to put those 21 million people back to work if there's the will, both on the corporate side and the government side, and frankly, these half-dozen tools.
Yeah. Just much more simply, there's always been kind of a notion in economics that the income that is paid to those who produce products is the same income that allows those producers then to become consumers to consume the products. And if you see a migration that is unimpeded in your worldview, well, let's make all these products in Shenzhen, China, where you can pay 50 cents an hour, hire somebody that will work 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, and that's just fine. What you have said to the American worker is the things that you fought for a century, safe workplaces, fair wages, work hours, and so on, those are obliterated. We don't give a damn about those things. They don't count anymore because you can't compete with others who have no such restrictions, and we're demanding you compete with them. My point is, unless you fix that, this doesn't work in our country's economic interest. We have to be a country, in order to be a world economic power, that has a first-rate manufacturing capability and maintains it and worries about it and puts people to work producing things.
I have to comment. I want to take this gentleman here who's got his hand high up, but Mitzi, it also takes a national investment strategy. I mean, one of the things that's just unbelievable is you've got the President of the United States talking about all these sectors in which he wants the United States to compete. The New America Foundation issued a paper on America's green jobs deficit. It's extraordinary. Leo Hendrie was speaking at the Center for American Progress, 3 weeks ago. We've got 750,000 jobs that are considered to be green. You can't grow that by and at some level, every dollar that goes into that, unless you put a manufacturing and R&D and education strategy together, the dollars that go into that, as much as we like a green country, actually mostly go to Germany and China. So now, it's great to get a green economy on some level, and that may be a net positive. But it would also be useful to use and leverage the power of federal dollars in investment in a way that ties NSF, that ties university structures, that ties state investment strategies and places together in an investment strategy. And we don't do that. And that's a comment that Leo Hendrie made. This gentleman right here. Yes, sir.
Hi, Matt Benjamin, Medley Global Advisors. To your point, Senator, about manufacturing, credible economists say the best thing that can happen to reindustrialize the United States is to get China to stop manipulating its currency. Schumer and Graham reintroduced a new bill similar to their old one just this week. What do you think the chances are that this bill passes the Senate this year, and why is it different this time?
Senator.
This is not a new issue. We've been talking about this issue for a long time. I hope it passes. I'll support it, and something we've been working on. It's just one part of what China is doing, as you know. It's not the whole enchilada here, as they say. That's mixing metaphors, isn't it?
Tasty one.
So you don't sound hopeful about that hope.
Look, no, I think we should. I think we should do that, but I don't think it's likely to pass in this Congress. Let me make just two other very quick points. Number one, smart people, you and I and others, well, maybe you at least, could put together a national investment bank to reinvigorate investment in building and rebuilding America's infrastructure. We could do that and should do that now, which would cause massive numbers of jobs. Second, we passed a nearly $800 billion economic recovery, or so-called stimulus act, and I put a little provision in the Senate. And I mean, you'd have thought that I was pushing our country right off the side of the earth. It was called Buy American. If you're going to stimulate our economy, how about stimulating with buying goods produced in America? Oh, man. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post had seizures over this.
And it was WTO consistent.
And it was WTO consistent. And, of course, China and Japan, they also had stimulus programs that were Buy China and Buy Japan.
But can I just add to that? The senator did do that. Yet on November the 16th of last year, China passed what's called the Indigenous Innovation Act that prescribes 100% of purchases at both the central and provincial levels must be Chinese. There was no corollary editorial anywhere near the newspapers that excoriated the senator just last year when he brought forth a WTO-compliant Buy Domestic, Buy American initiative.
We're going to take one last question. I'm going to ask my team to come up here and plan to move these tables right away, because we've got to get the senator out, get the congressman up here, because he's got a White House commitment, get the next panel. So everybody get ready up here. We're going to ask Alan Tonelson to take the last question here for this first session. Alan?
I
take the mic, Alan.
Sorry. It's really critical, though, to make one extra comment about the WTO compliancy, if that's a word, of the Buy American provisions in the stimulus bill. They unfortunately leave way too much of that hole at the, bottom of that bathtub wide open,
because that prevents us from applying Buy American provisions to most of our leading trade partners. There are a few exceptions, China, Brazil, India, etc. The European Union, we have to treat their contractors as U.S. companies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc. So I don't see how we get an investment strategy or any competitiveness strategy without changing our policy toward the World Trade Organization. It is handcuffing common sense efforts to put Americans to work and to get our economy back up and running. And we are not going to solve this as long as so much of that hole remains unplugged.
Thank you, Alan. Reactions?
I agree.
Leo, final word?
I agree.
Thanks for staying on time. Thank you both very much. Senator, thanks for being with us. Leo, thank you so much.
Steve. All right, good.